Pyre Glen was not a city. It was a cage of iron and ash. It sat at the edge of the black pine border like a festering wound, a hyper-militarized stronghold built on the bones of the old world. The sky above the slums was a perpetual, suffocating canopy of smog, choked by the endless exhaust of the Inquisition's war machines. It was a place designed to crush the weak, a lawless, freezing labyrinth where survival belonged entirely to those who kept their mouths shut and their doors bolted. Aurelia survived because she never looked away from the mud. She was a pragmatic, hardened apothecary, operating in the bleeding edge of the city's underbelly. Her hands were permanently stained with the bitter sap of nightshade and the rust of cheap surgical tools. She wore a heavy, tattered waxed canvas coat to ward off the biting, relentless sleet, her boots sinking into the freezing muck of the alleyways. She didn't believe in the Inquisition's divine right. She didn't believe in the monsters rumored to roam beyond the wall. She believed in the tangible weight of crushed herbs, the raw alcohol she used to sterilize her needles, and the meager rations they could buy her at the black market. But as she dragged her boots through the narrow, suffocating corridor of Scrapper's Lane, the universe violently forced her to look into the shadows. The scent hit her first, a thick, metallic stench of fresh blood, violently clashing with the unnatural, acrid burn of melted silver. Aurelia drew her scavenged trench knife, her breath pluming in the freezing air as she approached the dead end of the alley, expecting to find the butchered remains of a smuggler or a drunk who owed the wrong syndicate. Instead, she found a nightmare bleeding out in the freezing mud. He was the most terrifying, imposing creature she had ever laid eyes on. Even unconscious, he was massive, built of corded, lethal muscle and clad in shattered, darkened leather armor that was practically fused to his skin. His dark hair was matted with rain and luminescent, unnaturally thick blood. He was an alpha, a shifter of the highest, most lethal order, trapped deep inside the walls of a city that burned his kind at the stake. Aurelia stood over him, her mind screaming at her to run. The penalty for harboring a shifter, let alone an alpha, was public execution. The Inquisition patrols would hang her from the city gates and leave the crows to finish the job. She took a step back, her pragmatic mind calculating the exact distance to her hidden clinic. But then, a low, rattling breath tore through his chest. Aurelia saw the wounds. 3 massive, jagged tears across his abdomen. But it wasn't just torn flesh. Deep inside the muscle, jagged shards of raw silver were lodged against his ribs, burning his cellular structure from the inside out. He was dying, poisoned by the very metal designed to suppress his regenerative healing. He had been betrayed, ambushed with specialized Inquisition weaponry meant to bring down a god. Aurelia didn't run, and she didn't plunge her knife into his throat to collect the massive bounty on his head. She dropped her heavy medical satchel into the mud, her practical, apothecary's mind entirely taking over. For the next hour, she waged a silent, brutal war against his dead weight. Every muscle in her body screamed as she dragged his massive, unconscious frame through the labyrinth of the slums, desperately avoiding the sweeping searchlights of the Inquisition towers. She hauled him down the hidden trapdoor of her clinic, plunging them into the suffocating, dim confines of her subterranean cellar. The air was thick with the scent of dried lavender and antiseptics. She hoisted him onto her reinforced iron operating table, the metal groaning under his immense weight. She didn't use divine healing or magic. She used what she had. She pulled iron forceps, a spool of heavy surgical thread, and a bottle of pure grain alcohol from her shelves. "This is going to hurt," she muttered, her voice rough from the cold, fully aware he couldn't hear her. She poured the alcohol directly into the open, torn flesh of his chest. The alpha's massive body violently convulsed, a feral, guttural growl ripping through his throat even in his comatose state. Aurelia gritted her teeth, ignoring the sheer, terrifying power radiating from his skin. She drove the iron forceps deep into his chest cavity. The slick, sickening sound of metal scraping against bone echoed in the tight, claustrophobic cellar. She clamped down on the first shard of silver and pulled. The toxic metal sizzled as it left his flesh, dropping into a steel basin with a heavy, bloody clink. For 4 agonizing hours, she worked in the dim lamplight. Her hands were slick with his blood, her muscles shaking from the sheer physical toll of holding his convulsing, lethal body down while she extracted the poison slowly killing him. She stitched the massive tears in his torso with thick, heavy thread, anchoring his flesh back together with the crude, desperate ingenuity of a survivor. When she finally tied the last knot, she collapsed backward into a wooden chair, completely exhausted, her chest heaving. She expected him to remain unconscious for days, giving her enough time to figure out how to smuggle him back outside the city walls before the patrols kicked her door in. But as the last piece of silver hit the basin, the heavy, oppressive silence of the cellar was violently shattered. The air pressure in the room suddenly dropped, heavy with a dark, terrifying kinetic energy. The Alpha's eyes snapped open. They were a piercing, catastrophic shade of burning, unnatural gold. He didn't look confused. He didn't look weak. The exiled beast looked directly at the mortal woman covered in his blood. When Cassian fully awakened, the burning, liquid fire of the silver that had been consuming his cellular structure was gone, replaced by a tight, pulling ache across his chest. He was Cassian, the Alpha commander of the Blood Iron Pack. He had been betrayed, gutted by his own lieutenants who had sold his patrol routes to the Inquisition in exchange for a pathetic peace treaty. He had expected to rot in the freezing mud of the human slums, his body burning from the inside out, stripped of his pack, his title, and his life. He took a slow, rattling breath, feeling the heavy pull of thick cord against his torn muscle. If one were to capture an interior close-up of his face in the dim light, they would see his jaw tightly clenched, his golden eyes flashing with a feral, fragmented violence still warring in his mind. He flexed his massive arms. The muscle tore slightly against the thick surgical thread, a sharp sting of pain radiating outward, but the wounds held. He wasn't dead. He was anchored. Cassian looked around the cramped, miserable confines of the subterranean clinic he found himself in. The air was a heavy, suffocating blend of dried blood, crushed nightshade, and the sharp, sterile bite of pure alcohol. The stone walls wept with condensation, and the low wooden beams of the ceiling pressed down on him. But sitting in the corner, calmly wiping his blood from her trench knife with a scrap of burlap, was Aurelia. She didn't look at him with the terror the humans of Pyre Glen usually reserved for his kind. She didn't cower in the shadows, and she didn't scramble for the heavy iron pistol resting on the table beside her. She simply watched him, her gaze calculating and clinical. Framed against the flickering lantern light like a sweeping cinematic wide shot composed in a strict 16:9 aspect ratio, the stark contrast between the gritty, fragile human and the towering, supernatural predator was absolute. She tossed a battered tin cup of water onto the iron table beside him. It clattered loudly in the oppressive silence. "Drink," she ordered, her voice completely devoid of panic or awe. "The thread will hold the muscle together until your accelerated healing kicks in, but you can't shift yet. The physical expansion will snap the stitches and tear the wounds open again. Give it 2 days, keep your heart rate down, and then you have to leave before the Inquisition sweeps this block." Cassian stared at her. The water dripped slowly from a leaking pipe overhead, ticking like a metronome in the tense silence. His ancient, predatory mind struggled to process the sheer, terrifying audacity of the mortal sitting in front of him. In the brutal hierarchy of the Black Pine border, to spill an Alpha's blood was a death sentence. To even look an Alpha in the eyes without permission was an invitation for violence. But to stitch his flesh, to reach into his chest cavity with iron tools and pull the lethal silver from his bones, was something entirely different. It was an ancient, unbreakable biological law of his kind. In the deep lore of the shifters, an Alpha was autonomous, subservient to no one. But to heal an Alpha on the brink of true death was to forge a blood bond. By fixing him, by weaving her thread through his torn muscle, mixing her scent with his open veins, and anchoring his flesh to her will, Aurelia had unknowingly invoked a primal right of absolute claiming. She hadn't just saved a life, she had tethered a monster. Leave, Cassian rumbled. His voice was a deep, resonant frequency, a dangerous sub-bass that vibrated through the stone floor and made the glass apothecary jars on the shelves rattle against one another. Yes, leave, Aurelia replied, exasperated, tossing her bloody rag into the steel basin with a wet slap. I dug the silver out of you. The debt is paid. I don't know who put those blades in you, and whatever pack where you're fighting out there in the trees, I don't want any part of it. The moment you can walk without bleeding out on my floor, you get out of my city and forget you ever saw me. Cassian slowly sat up. The heavy iron operating table groaned under his shifting weight. Even hunched over in the low-ceilinged cellar, his massive, corded frame radiated a suffocating, intense aura of pure, unadulterated dominance. The crude surgical thread pulling his flesh together caught the dim lantern light, looking less like a medical suture and more like a permanent, glorious brand of ownership. He swung his legs off the table, the raw power of his movements completely dwarfing the small room. He crossed the cramped space in 2 strides, crouching down until he was directly eye level with her. Aurelia froze. Her breath caught in her throat as the overwhelming heat of his unnaturally warm body washed over her, chasing away the cellar's damp chill. The scent of pine, ozone, and raw, dangerous male flooded her senses. She could see the intricate, scarred textures of his skin, the flex of his jaw, and the terrifying, consuming fire in his golden eyes. You do not understand what you have done, little apothecary, Cassian whispered, his voice dark and heavy with obsession. He reached out. His movements were slow, deliberately telegraphing his intent so she wouldn't flinch. His massive, calloused hand gently traced the dried blood on her knuckles, his blood, which she had shed to put him back together. The touch was incredibly tender, a terrifying contrast to the lethal violence his body was built for. You pulled the poison from my heart, he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. You poured your scent into my open wounds. The thread you wrapped around my flesh tethers my wolf to your soul. Aurelia swallowed hard, her practical mind desperately trying to reject the massive, possessive force cornering her. This wasn't how the world worked. Monsters didn't pledge themselves, they slaughtered. It's just surgical thread, she argued weakly, her voice losing its previous hardened edge. It's a medical procedure. I was just fixing a problem in the alley. It is a claim, Cassian corrected, his voice dropping to a lethal, dark purr that sent a shiver straight down her spine. He leaned in, closing the final inch of space between them until his lips were hovering just a breath away from her ear. I am no longer bound to the blood iron pack. They are dead to me. I am bound to you. I will not leave this cellar. I will not return to the forest. Where you walk, I walk. Who threatens you, I tear apart. You fixed my broken body, Aurelia. And now, the beast belongs entirely to you. Aurelia stared at him, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, the sound so loud she was certain his enhanced hearing could pick up every erratic beat. She had just wanted to save a dying creature in the mud. She hadn't realized she was accidentally leashing the most dangerous alpha in the territories to her own pulse. The cellar, once her safe haven, now felt like a locked cage. But as she looked into his burning eyes, she realized the terrifying truth. She wasn't trapped in a cage with him. He had built the cage around her, and he would murder anything that tried to get inside. The delicate, terrifying tension inside the subterranean clinic held for 3 excruciating days. Aurelia had spent every waking hour trying to maintain a semblance of her pragmatic routine, desperately attempting to ignore the towering, exiled alpha who sat quietly in the darkest corner of the room, tracking her every movement with a dark, unwavering devotion. She ground her herbs, distilled her tinctures, and meticulously cleaned her surgical tools, repeatedly telling Cassian that his accelerated healing was sufficient and he needed to leave. He simply offered a terrifying, knowing smile, the golden fire in his eyes burning brighter with every passing hour, and completely refused to move. But survival in Pyre Glen was never quiet for long, and the Inquisition did not stop hunting until they had a body to burn. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of iron-shod boots in the freezing mud above severed the quiet of the cellar like a blade. Aurelia froze, the glass pestles slipping from her fingers and clattering against the wooden workbench. It wasn't just a passing patrol, it was a localized sweep. She could hear the harsh, barked orders of an Inquisitor captain bleeding through the floorboards, followed by the violent sounds of doors being kicked off their hinges down Scrapper's Lane. Cassian's demeanor changed in a fraction of a second. The quiet, obsessive watcher vanished, instantly replaced by the apex predator of the Black Pine. If framed in an American angle-wide shot, the composition of the room would capture the exact moment the atmosphere shifted. Aurelia, small and rigid in the foreground, illuminated by the harsh, flickering lantern light, while Cassian rose from the shadows in the background, his massive frame uncoiling with lethal grace. The heavy surgical thread weaving his chest together strained against his expanding, corded muscle as his feral instincts surged to the surface. "Stay behind me," Cassian commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl that shook the glass vials on the shelves. "They're searching for you," Aurelia hissed, frantically wiping down the metal operating table with bleach to mask the lingering scent of his blood. "If they see you, they'll burn the whole block. Get back in the alcove and mask your scent. I know how to handle the patrols." Before Cassian could argue, the heavy oak door of her street-level apothecary was violently blown inward, the sound of splintering wood echoing down the stone stairwell. Heavy, armored footsteps immediately began descending into the cellar. Aurelia grabbed a clean rag and a bottle of medicinal alcohol, forcing her hands to stop shaking as she stepped to the base of the stairs, deliberately placing her body between the descending threat and the shadowed corner where Cassian stood. 3 Inquisitors breached the cellar. They were massive, brutal enforcers clad in the heavy, spiked iron armor of the ruling class, wielding short-barreled rifles loaded with silver slag rounds. The captain stepped into the dim light, his face obscured by a slitted iron helm, but the cruelty in his posture was unmistakable. He took a long, slow breath, his head tilting as he processed the heavy, suffocating smells of the clinic. "You're running a lot of bleach today, little apothecary," the captain sneered, his voice metallic and distorted behind the iron mask. He leveled his rifle, the barrel sweeping the small room. A beast bled out in the mud a few streets over, left a trail that vanished right around your front door. "I run bleach every day," Aurelia replied, her voice cold and deadpan, an absolute mask of pragmatic indifference. "It's a slum, Captain. Everything bleeds. If you want to search my cabinets for contraband, show me a warrant. Otherwise, you're tracking mud onto my clean floor." The captain let out a dark, grating laugh. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them in a single, aggressive stride. "I am the warrant, you insolent rat." Without warning, the captain swung the heavy iron stock of his rifle. It was a brutal, punishing blow aimed directly at her face. Aurelia tried to duck, but the iron clipped her temple, the sheer force of the impact throwing her violently backward. She crashed into the wooden workbench, a sharp gasp tearing from her lips as a hot trail of blood instantly split down her cheek. She didn't even hit the stone floor before the world ended. The shadows in the corner of the cellar didn't just detach themselves, they exploded. Cassian had been suppressing his immense, suffocating alpha aura to hide from the patrols, but the moment the iron struck his claimed mate, the tether holding his control snapped entirely. A localized, catastrophic shockwave of pure, blinding kinetic pressure blew through the subterranean room. The glass vials on the shelves shattered simultaneously, raining sharp debris onto the stone. The temperature in the cellar skyrocketed, the air growing so dense and heavy with predatory malice that it became physically difficult to breathe. The 3 Inquisitors froze, their arrogant cruelty instantly evaporating into absolute, mind-breaking terror. The towering, heavily scarred Alpha stepped out of the darkness. The crude black surgical thread binding his chest seemed to pulse against his burning skin, a testament to the mortal he was about to slaughter for. His eyes were not just gold. They were a catastrophic, burning wildfire. "You struck my mate," Cassian stated. It wasn't a roar. It was a cold, absolute decree of execution that promised a slow, agonizing death. The captain screamed, wildly pulling the trigger of his rifle. The silver slag round tore through the confined space, striking Cassian dead in the shoulder. The Alpha didn't even flinch. The kinetic impact merely pushed him back a half-inch, his accelerated healing already rejecting the metal before it could penetrate the muscle. Cassian moved with a velocity that the human eye simply could not track, a blur of lethal, unadulterated violence. He didn't draw a weapon. His body was the apex weapon of the old world. He appeared directly in front of the captain, his massive, clawed hand wrapping entirely around the man's iron helm. With a sickening, effortless crunch of metal and bone, he crushed the helmet inward, throwing the lifeless body across the room where it smashed through the wooden staircase. The remaining two Inquisitors broke into a panicked, frantic retreat, scrambling backward over the debris of the stairs, desperately trying to chamber new rounds. "None of you get to walk out of the dark," Cassian roared, the sound harmonizing with the terrifying, apocalyptic power of his wolf. He lunged. In a sweeping, cinematic display of pure brutality, he closed the distance, his hands tearing through the spiked iron armor as if it were parchment. He systematically, brutally dismantled them, turning the clinical sanctuary of the apothecary into a slaughterhouse in less than 20 seconds. There was no mercy, no hesitation, only the violent, obsessive drive of an alpha protecting his territory. When the screaming finally stopped, the cellar was dead silent save for the heavy, ragged breathing of the exiled commander. Cassian stood amidst the carnage, his hands and chest coated in the blood of his enemies. The air around him cracked with residual, terrifying energy. He didn't look at the bodies. He turned slowly, his burning golden eyes locking onto Aurelia, who was clutching the edge of the workbench, staring at him in absolute awe and terror. The beast had protected what was his, and now he was coming to collect. The silence that settled over the subterranean clinic was no longer the quiet of a sanctuary. It was the suffocating, heavy stillness of a graveyard. The metallic tang of fresh blood completely overpowered the scent of crushed lavender and sterile alcohol. Aurelia stood frozen against the splintered remains of her wooden workbench, her hand pressing a clean rag to the bleeding cut on her temple. She stared at the mangled, iron-clad bodies of the Inquisition enforcers littering her floor, the absolute reality of her situation crashing down upon her in a cold, paralyzing wave. She hadn't just harbored a fugitive. She had been the catalyst for the slaughter of high-ranking city officials. In Pyre Glen, there was no trial for what lay on her floor. There was only the pyre. Cassian turned his back on the carnage, dismissing the dead with the cold apathy of a warlord who had ended thousands of lives. His massive chest heaved, the thick surgical thread pulling taut against his expanding muscles, stained black with the blood of his enemies. He closed the distance between them, his heavy boots crunching over the shattered glass of her apothecary vials. He didn't ask if she was all right. The ancient beast operated entirely on the primal need to verify her safety with his own senses. He reached out, his large, blood-soaked hands gently framing her face. The contrast was terrifying and completely intoxicating. The sheer, unadulterated brutality he had just unleashed, paired with the impossibly tender way his thumbs wiped the trailing blood from her cheek. His unnatural, burning golden eyes scanned her injury, the feral fire within them flaring with a violent, possessive rage. "My clinic is gone," Aurelia whispered, her voice trembling as the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a cold, biting terror. She looked past his massive shoulder at the ruined cellar. "My life in this city is over. When the patrol misses their check-in, they will send a battalion. They will burn the entire block to ash just to ensure I don't escape. Let them send their battalions," Cassian rumbled, his voice a deep, vibrating frequency that seemed to hum directly against her ribs. "This city was a cage, Aurelia. A tomb of iron and rust that didn't deserve to breathe the same air as you. You pulled the poison from my heart. You tethered my soul to yours. You are no longer a citizen of Pyre Glen. He didn't give her a chance to pack her scavenged tools. He didn't allow her to mourn the meager, miserable life she had scraped together in the mud. The Alpha claimed what was his, and his only objective was to remove his mate from the line of fire. Before she could protest, Cassian stepped forward and swept her off her feet, lifting her into his massive arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Aurelia gasped, instinctively wrapping her arms around his thick, corded neck. The heat radiating from his skin was an absolute, comforting furnace against the damp chill of the cellar. Cassian carried her up the splintered remains of the stairwell, kicking the ruined oak door out of his way, and stepped out into the freezing, sleet-filled alley of Scrapper's Lane. The city was already waking up to the slaughter. In the distance, the heavy, grating sound of the Inquisition's iron alarm bells began to toll, a horrific, rhythmic clanging that echoed off the smog-choked stone walls. Searchlights from the Central Guard towers sliced through the bruised, polluted sky, sweeping the slums for the breach. Pyre Glen was locking down, preparing to hunt the monster within its walls. Cassian stood in the center of the muddy street, entirely unbothered by the approaching threat. If captured in a sweeping cinematic shot, it would be an American angle-wide composition. The towering, scarred Alpha holding the fragile mortal in his arms, framed against the suffocating, hyper-militarized architecture of the city, the flashing warning lights casting them in harsh, dramatic shadows. He did not run. An exiled Alpha did not flee. He conquered. Cassian tilted his head back, his golden eyes locking onto the dark, bruised sky above the city walls, and unleashed a sound that shattered the very atmosphere of Pyre Glen. It was not a roar. It was a howl. A world-shaking, catastrophic frequency of pure, ancient dominance that rolled over the iron rooftops and hit the distant tree-line of the black pine border like a physical shockwave. It was a summons. It was a declaration of war. It was the exiled commander of the Blood Iron Pack loudly announcing to the world that he was alive. He was lethal, and he was calling his loyalists to break the city that dared to threaten his mate. For 10 excruciating seconds, the city held its breath. The iron bell seemed to falter against the echoing power of the Alpha's command. And then, the forest answered. A cacophony of terrifying, feral howls erupted from the darkness beyond the walls. The ground beneath Pyre Glen began to vibrate. Aurelia buried her face in Cassian's neck, her heart hammering as the sheer scale of his power became horrifyingly clear. He hadn't just been a lone wolf bleeding in the mud. He was a god of war, and his army had been waiting for him to speak. The first explosions detonated at the northern gate. The heavy iron doors, designed to withstand siege engines, buckled and tore inward as massive, monstrous shapes of shadow and teeth poured into the stronghold. The loyalists of the Blood Iron Pack, massive beasts the size of war horses, flooded the streets, their eyes glowing with the same violent fire as their Alpha. They crashed into the Inquisition battalions, tearing through the armored enforcers with ruthless, systematic precision. Cassian did not join the fray. He didn't need to. He was the king walking through the apocalypse, his only priority the safety of the woman in his arms. He carried Aurelia through the chaotic streets, his dark aura projecting a physical barrier of pure intimidation that parted the warring factions. As the Inquisition fell, the fires began. The wolves overturned the massive oil braziers used to light the slums, the flames quickly catching the dry, rotted wood of the tenements. The fire spread with unnatural speed, a cleansing, terrifying inferno that ate through the smog and painted the night sky in brilliant, devastating shades of orange and red. The cage of iron and ash was melting. Cassian was ensuring that there would be absolutely no stronghold left to send hunters after her. He was burning her city to the ground to keep her safe. They reached the shattered remains of the northern gate. Behind them, Pyre Glen was a towering pillar of fire and screaming metal. The heat washed over Aurelia's back, but she felt no fear, only the overwhelming, obsessive protection of the beast holding her. Cassian stepped out of the ash and into the cool, pristine darkness of the black pine forest. He stopped beneath the massive, ancient pines, finally setting Aurelia down on her feet. The flickering light of her burning city danced across his heavily scarred face, illuminating the stark silver threads that still bound his chest. He leaned down, his forehead resting gently against hers, completely enveloping her in his scent and his presence. "They will never hunt you again," Cassian whispered, his voice an absolute, unbreakable vow. "The world that hurt you is ash, Aurelia. The law of the Inquisition is dead. You claimed the beast in the dark, and now the beast claims you in the light. You are the queen of the Blood Iron Pack, and this forest will bow to you." He didn't wait for her permission. The ancient Alpha operated on the divine right of possession. Cassian captured her lips in a consuming, possessive kiss that tasted of rain, smoke, and absolute, unbreakable devotion, leaving the burning ruins of Pyre Glen behind them forever. But what do you think? Was Aurelia right to save the bleeding monster in the alley, or did she unknowingly unleash a terrifying apocalypse upon her own people? Did Cassian take his ancient, possessive instincts too far by burning an entire city to the ground just to ensure the absolute safety of the mortal who saved his life? Is there a line between fierce protection and dark obsession, or does true love in the monster romance world demand burning it all down for the one you claim? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this epic tale of dark fantasy romance, a pragmatic apothecary, and a completely obsessed, lethal alpha who refuses to let her go, please smash that like button and share this video with your fellow Romantasy fans. And if you want to find out how Aurelia navigates ruling the wild, terrifying forces of the Blood Iron Pack alongside her violently protective mate, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next epic tale.